Thank you for joining me for this seventh session in the Lifeway study of the Gospel of John. The text is John chapter 5, verse 5 through 16, and the title is Pick Up Your Mat. The lesson summary statement is Jesus is Lord over all creation and values all people. I'm using as my introduction to the lesson the story that's found at goexplorethebible.com. It's the story of the man that during the time of Christmas helped rescue 20 people out of the snow and found a school where they could stay and until they could be rescued by the authorities. The personal study guide of our students on page 64, the first paragraph talks about the difference between pity and compassion. And I'm going to ask my class, can you illustrate the difference between pity and compassion as this author is explaining it? And just to get the class going, I'm tell them a story about my wife and my grandchildren and I going to one of these fast food restaurants that has a playground. And we order our food, and the grandkids and I go back to the playground for them to eat and then begin to play. But my wife noticed a homeless man in that restaurant. And so after we'd gotten our food and taken it away, she goes back to the counter and orders this man a full meal and takes it to him. Now, I may have seen the man and I may have had pity for the man and his circumstances, but it was my wife that had the compassion. And I'm asking the class if they could give other examples that maybe distinguish between those two things. Now, imagine with me what Jesus thought and felt about this man. He is this man's creator. He values this man enough to come to earth and eventually die on the cross for this man. Now, chapters 5 to 7 is recording a shift that is taking place. There's been a reservation, a hesitancy about Jesus, but now it comes down to outright official opposition. This is the first point of controversy has to deal with the Sabbath. Now, Jesus performed these signs, and John records for us 7 signs, and the signs were to draw the people in, to make the people curious. And as they follow Jesus, he begins to be more public about who he is. And John also records signs and produces the negative reaction that people have about it. So what's happening as these signs are beginning to be more public, there's either a reception of Jesus or there is a rejection of Jesus. The context of this lesson is the Pool of Bethesda. Now, just north of the Temple Mount, the temple, was this pool. It was a large pool. It was a place that travelers would come in and who were pilgrims, and they would refresh themselves there. And the pool was large. It was 400 feet long. It was about 160 feet wide. It was ringed with shade for the people. It was cut in half, and there was shade there as well. And you could imagine a pool that large could have a large number of people there. This is where this takes place, where Jesus singles out this one individual to perform this healing. So in this lesson, we see that Jesus is the creator and he values all people. First point is compassion expressed. John chapter 5, verses 5 through 9. Now again, the lesson summary statement I want the people to notice is Jesus is Lord over all creation. So he can do whatever he wants, and he values all people. And I want the class, I'm asking the class, how is that revealed in this lesson? We're going to read verses 5 through 9 and point out where it reveals Jesus is Lord over all and Jesus values all people. You may call on somebody to read the text. And then ask the question, how is Jesus revealed as Lord over creation? And we see the healing that he does for this man. He simply speaks. Imagine that. How little power does it take to speak a word? And yet Jesus is so powerful that he speaks. And he speaks to a man who has been lame for 38 years. How bound and restricted he must be, and yet Jesus is the Lord of creation. You could go on and talk about different things where he reveals himself. And hopefully what happens is that'll give you an opportunity to maybe give a further explanation about the text. For example, the 38 years. What this is revealing, we don't know whether the man has been born this way and so he's 38 years old, or whether the man's 58 years old and he's been this way for 38 years, and at one time he knew what it was like to have two strong legs that he could run and work and do those kinds of things. And he's been almost 4 decades lame. He's been lame longer than Jesus has been alive. In fact, some of you teaching this, this man's been lame longer than you and your class have been alive. But the point that's being driven at here is this is no easy healing. And yet Jesus does it so effortlessly. He simply speaks. And then where do we see that he values all people? Well, notice it says that Jesus saw the man, and that means that Jesus had compassion for the man. He understood this man and what it must have been like to be lame for 38 years. It says that Jesus takes the initiative. Jesus offers to heal the man. There are numbers of ways in which Jesus is expressing his value for this man. And then just some of the things about the text that you might want to point out. Jesus asks him, "Sir, do you want to get well?" Which just seems to be a strange question. The word "well" there is used 6 times in John's Gospel, 5 times in this chapter, 1 time in chapter 7, and the word "do you want to be made whole?" So it's, in one sense, it's more than just a physical healing that Jesus is offering this man. But notice, you would expect that after 38 years, the man would go, "Yes." But what he actually does is he doesn't answer Jesus' question. He starts giving an explanation as to why he hasn't been healed. In other words, he's saying it's not my fault. The number one excuse for people not changing their lives is, you don't understand my situation. I'm the exception to the power of God. I'm the exception to obeying God. And so it's a very good question that Jesus asks. Let me give you some lame man excuses and answer how Jesus would respond to these. For example, here's a lame man excuse. You don't understand. I'm an exception to the power and to obeying God. That's why I can't tithe. Now, that may be that may not be an issue, but certainly God expects us to be generous people. That's why I can't be generous. Can't even give a copper penny to the church and to the work of God. What is that excuse all about? Is someone really so poor that they can't be contributing and supporting the work of God? The widow who gave the widow's mite found a way to do that. How about this one? Here's a lame man's excuse. You don't understand. I'm the exception to the power of God and to obedience to God. I can't control my emotions. I've got red hair. I'm Irish. This is the way our family always dealt with things, and I just simply can't change. Or whatever the issue might be, whether it's anger or fear or a negative spirit or depression, you can come up with some other examples. Because of Jesus' compassion, he offered this man a new life, and he offers us a new life. And it begins with hearing Jesus' word and obeying and trusting Jesus. And this man, when he did, he experienced the life-changing power of Christ. Notice in verse 8, there's 3 commands: get up, pick up, and walk. And the man instantly got well, picked up his mat, and started to walk. And the word walk there has about the idea of walking about. He walked about so much that he walked away from the pool of Bethesda. He doesn't stagger off in a halting manner because he has enough strength. He can roll up his mat and carry it with him. This is just an astounding miracle. 38 years, his muscles have atrophied, his tendons have just become like cords of iron in terms of them being able to bend and to suffer. His ankles has probably fused into a solidness, almost a one total bone. It is amazing. Think about it, 38 years, he's probably lost his equilibrium, just the ability to stand. This is an amazing miracle that Jesus performs when he says this. All he says is get up, pick up, and walk. And because this man trusted and obeyed, he experienced a new life. And this is what Jesus offers all of us when he touches us about a particular area that we need to trust and obey in. The second point is legalism exposed. I thought the thing that would be helpful for my class is if we just took a moment to understand legalism. And so I came across a piece, and there's a lot of information out there, but this is a piece from the Competent to Counsel International. Competent to Counsel International. And the title of it is What is Legalism? And so I'm going to make them a copy of this, and it gives 3 points. Legalism is believing that salvation can be earned by obedience. Legalism is believing that one can obey the Bible through his own will and power for the purpose of gaining a greater measure of God's approval and favor. And he's got some explanation through that, and I'll point that out. And then last of all, legalism elevates man-made rules above Scripture. So I'm wanting them to understand legalism. I found another article. It's by R.C. Sproul, S-P-R-O-U-L, and it's an excerpt from How Can I Develop a Christian Conscience? And it talks about, have you as a Christian ever been accused of legalism? And so what I'm doing is I'm just wanting to take a moment in the class, and I want everyone, as best we can, to understand what we're talking about that's going to be exposed. And so after I've given some information, put some information in their hand, we've talked about it, then I'd like for someone to read this text in the class. I may read this text and give some explanation. Let me just mention some things. 9b says, now that the day was the Sabbath. Now that may at first appear to be an insignificant detail, but the truth of the matter, that statement is really the central statement. Because all of this story is not so much about the healing of the man, it's about the controversy that comes from this healing about the Sabbath. Because one of the things that caused the Jewish leadership to want to kill Jesus is the way he responded and broke their laws, not God's laws, but their laws about the Sabbath. And so it says, now that day was the Sabbath, so the Jews said to the man who had been healed, and it's written in a tense in the language of the Bible that means that there was a permanent healing. This is the Sabbath. And in fact, in the original language, instead of saying this is the Sabbath, it really says Sabbath, this is. And it's putting the emphasis on the Sabbath. The law prohibits you from picking up your mat. He replied, now notice his answer. He replied, the man who made me well told me, pick up your mat. Now, if you were to just stop there, what do you think would be the next question that the Pharisees would ask? Well, what was wrong with you? And then to find out that they'd been 38 years lame and healed. You would think that would be the direction, but that's not. Who is this man who told you, pick up your mat and walk? It's one thing to have a man carrying a mat on the Sabbath that breaks one of their man-made laws, but to have a man going around telling other people to break the Sabbath, that's something altogether different. They see that as very dangerous. But the man who was healed didn't know who it was because Jesus had slipped away from the crowd that was there. That's interesting, isn't it? That's very different from our day. No fanfare, no stadium filled, no money changing hands, no advertisement of great healing service. Jesus simply heals the man and steps away into the crowd. So, after that text, and after an explanation about legalism, I'm asking the question, do you see any of that as we read through the text? Where do you see the legalism that's happening here? Now here's an example of that day in which the lame man lived. He's facing a spirit in the culture that is very intimidating, and not to make excuses for him, but if we had lived in the day, we could have possibly understood maybe his fear for having been caught by the Jewish leaders breaking the Sabbath. They had 39 categories, and one of those categories was about bearing burdens. And of course, the typical kind of work in that day would involve some kind of carrying. And so they had all kinds of rules. You couldn't carry a needle in your clothing because that might lead you to sewing. You couldn't carry some kind of writing instrument because that might lead you to writing. There were only so many steps that you could take in the course of a day, a certain distance that you could go, and after that you were breaking the Sabbath. If you had a toothache, you couldn't put vinegar in your mouth that might help dull the pain because that would be healing. You just need to wait till the next day. And that would have been their message to Jesus. You just needed to wait till the next day if this is what you wanted to do. And it was just a multitude of unbelievable. You couldn't eat an egg that was laid on the Sabbath. Just all kinds of things. Years ago when I was in Israel, the elevators would run automatically so that you didn't have to reach over and punch the button. That would be considered work. I heard someone say that it used to be that Jewish people, devoted Jewish people, would stand at an elevator and wait till a Gentile came along and then would get on the elevator and ask the Gentile to punch the floor. And that way they could get around the issue of work by punching the floor. Just that kind of thing. So understand the atmosphere in which this man lived. It's so powerful that when it comes to breaking the Sabbath, you could be stoned. It's so powerful that the Jewish leaders, the religious leaders, make the decision they must kill Jesus because of the Sabbath laws that he was breaking in their mind. Now, if the essence of legalism is being more concerned about rules than about your relationship with God, with Jesus and others, then where is legalism found in our life and in our church? Because you see the point? Legalism exposed. So I'm going to use some examples that may not be fitting for you, and I don't know that they're so fitting for me. I certainly will use them in one class, won't use them in another class, but where is legalism exposed in our dress code? Where is legalism exposed in our dress code? Now, I'm wanting to talk to the class about the church that I'm privileged to pastor and just see what they said. I can remember all kinds of different dress codes over the years of me being a Christian. Another question, and again, this fits one class, but a couple of other classes I teach, it wouldn't be one to fit. But where is legalism exposed in our views on politics? Sometimes we can be very demeaning and divisive about politics. So anyway, however that might fit with you all. Now look at the lesson summary sentence again. Jesus is Lord over all creation and values all people. My point is that that is a good rule when it comes to examining legalism. Jesus has created people, Jesus has created governments, Jesus has created churches, and so he is Lord over all creation, and he values people. When we get that mix, when we get that out of whack, then there's very strong tendency to be legalistic. Now the last point is identity exposed. Again, I'm going to read through the text, verses 14 through 16, with some explanation. After this, Jesus found the man in the temple and said to him, "See, you are well." And again, he uses this tense that means it's permanent. The effects are permanent. You're not going to lapse back into lameness. And the word "see," I like the old King James Version that says "behold," because it's catching this idea. What I'm going to say to you is important. And so he says to the man, "You are well, do not sin anymore, so that something worse doesn't happen to you." Now, what could possibly be worse than 38 years of lameness? Because the man's not going to go back to lameness. Jesus is saying this healing is a permanent healing. And the commentators all seem to come along the same lines, and that is that Jesus may be referring to eternal judgment. And I agree with that. I'd also add this. It is to one time know Jesus, to be in love with Jesus, to have a fresh relationship with Jesus, and to lose that. Isn't that worse? And Jesus is saying to him, don't be careful of this. In verse 15, the man went and reported to the Jews that it was Jesus who had made him well. Now notice what he emphasizes to the Jews. He emphasizes his healing. There's a lot of debate about why this man did this. Donald Carson says guilty of dullness rather than treachery. The man goes and tells the Jews. He's not innocently giving credit to Jesus because the Jews have already displayed their hostility. So he says it's a matter of dullness. Some say it's a matter of preservation. Maybe so, because he's wanting to get off the list of possibly being banished. These are the men that are going to approve him getting accepted back in society. These are the men that could possibly cause even worse judgment to come upon him. Verse 16, therefore the Jews began persecuting Jesus because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. The word persecuting means they were continuing to persecute Jesus. They were hounding Jesus. They were pursuing Jesus. You remember recently where the Supreme Court made the decision about abortion, and the people who opposed that went to their homes in their neighborhoods, and for week after week, maybe they're still doing it, they would picket their homes and march outside their homes, and some of the judges had to leave their homes in order to find peace. They were hounded. This is the idea. And why did they do it? Because Jesus kept doing these things on the Sabbath. Now, Jesus wasn't doing that just to be rebellious towards the religious leaders, because the next verses, he goes on to explain why he's doing it. And his first explanation is, my Father is working on the Sabbath, and I'm just doing what my Father does. I'm doing the works of the Father. And so he's not being rebellious. He's just simply following the example of his Father. Now, to close the lesson, to finish up this lesson, this point, what ways has Jesus revealed to you that he is Lord over all and that he values people? For example, do you have an example of health? This past Sunday, a person came and asked if the deacons and the pastor would pray for them for their healing. They had had a serious issue with cancer, and they had taken the treatments, but they hadn't had any relief. They were getting about 2 hours of sleep a night. They had a continuing headache. And so we came together and we prayed for them. That person wrote me 3 days later and said the first night they slept 5 hours, and they'd only been sleeping 2. The second night they slept 9 hours, and since the first night they hadn't had any headaches. They go to the doctor for an MRI and examination, and the doctor tells them that they're in perfect condition. There's no evidence of cancer in their life. And this person says, it's been a long, long time since I felt this way. Well, what a coincidence. There's an example, I think, of God providing and demonstrating He is the creator of all and He values all people. Do you have an example like that in health? Do you have an example of that in marriage? There are other examples in the past and the present where God demonstrated, I'm in charge and I love you and value you. Now, to close the lesson, I want them to turn to page 71 in their personal study guide, and there's this blue box called Key Doctrine, the Christian and Social Order. And I'm going to ask them if they can name some specific cases, specific people in these categories. It says we should work to provide for the orphaned, the needy, the abused, the aged, the helpless, and the sick. And I'm going to, what I want to do on the board is I just want to write down maybe some specific people that the class knows who fit into these categories. And then to close the class, I'm going to say, how can we express the love that Jesus has for these people? And then maybe just make some assignments, have a project that we could do as a class in meeting some of the needs of these people. Wonderful lesson. God bless you for teaching God's Word. My prayers are with you. Amen.